is seen as a developing and is nominated to be one to host an international competition. Here, there's great acknowledgement or emphasis in the country, and there's that the people are watching in that clear in that competition. So what first argument would be how would other nations look at us? So this argument deals with the iconography of that country. So first, one out of two. First, because it is an international, then clearly we are being watched by the world. So the stakes here is that the reputation of a country is that the reputation of a country and how stable is the economy of that. Then clearly, it might be premature for a developing country to flex their resources. One, because it may be seen as a developing country, then the problem rests on the stability of the administration. And if it is, and clearly, as we've seen in other developing countries, or many examples, if then stated, if it's corrupt administration, then it can be road to embezzlement of funds. So here, it can be a tool to hide from corruption. Now, if we do label this competition to be that many politicians can use it to do or to hide something, because the people will be redirected that these funds are used for those things, competition that might be beneficial or can promote the country. Second is that it is misdirection to money of the people. So what this makes is that it can be a waste or it can be a clear misdirection of our funds and how the people will react to it. And if the press sees this, there will be collateral damage that will happen and there will be backlash. Next, and the problematic of this debate is the image of the image of the country. If that hosting is considered to be that hosting is seen to be a failure, then clearly that those things can be very damaging. The conditions of the game. If this competition continues, what will happen and the resources are used badly? What will happen to the conditions of the game? What will happen to the athletes that are on those games? And the collateral damage. If the opposition say that it can provide many jobs and certainties, then it might be clearly damaging to that. So if we put it in an example, that those resources of that company is used on the maintenance of its sporting complex, then if that country rarely uses these complexes, then those stadiums or venues will collapse due to loss of maintenance. Then clearly. So the opposition needs to defend how the party being able to host for its worthiness. And really, we think that up in this motion. Proud to propose.
Alright, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about international sporting events like Olympics, we think that these particular events covers a lot of wide range of audience, and we think that the whole international community is looking upon these particular international events, right? Therefore, we think that it's important for us to assess on how this particular sporting events is going to be a means to be able to develop this particular country, right? So that is why I'm going to argue to you on why we think that it's even more why we think that this particular using an international event is not really a loss, but it's also a gain from coming from these vulnerable individuals from these developing countries, right? But before that, I'm going to have a first process. Because they told you that it's going to be damaging towards those particular participants, right? When you're going to host, because you cannot be, probably one thing meant is that you cannot be able to host is because you don't have the capability as well. Number one, we think that this particular argumentation is a disability argumentation. We think that you have to assume that hosting an international event is hosting an international event, you have a capability, but we think that the wording that we have to argue in this debate is that why it's not going to be strategic if we're going to host a certain event, right? So we think that if that type of argumentation is what they really argue, we think that if this particular developing countries can be able to cater this particular participants, we think that are they really okay with that particular benefits, right? So on my argumentation, on the principle level, we think that coming from opening opposition, we think that hosting a certain event should be non-negotiable, right? Regardless of your disposition in a particular country, regardless of your ideology on your place in the international arena, right? So that is why when you talk about developing countries, we think that you don't have to deprive them of the chances to host these particular events. Especially if they really want to gain this particular recognition by hosting these particular events, right? That's exactly why when you send in, that's exactly why, for example, that's exactly why Philippines, for example, are sending representatives. It's because Philippines also wants that at some point, Philippines also wants to gain some particular recognition, right? That is why we think that hosting this particular international events is also, it's also a choice of these developing countries to be able to recognize by the international community, right? So we think that it's not about the issue of the capability, but we think that it's also an issue on how you use international sporting events as a means to be able to develop these countries, right? So if their principal argumentation is going to protect this particular vulnerable individual, because we're talking about developing country, talking about poor individuals, we think that we have to assess on how we're going to better make these individuals going to be better at the end of the day, right? So that is why on my second argumentation, I'm going to argue on the benefits on this particular hosting an international events, right? We can see that at some point that there's really a need, right? Which is why we have to deal on how do we better impose or how do we better improve the lives of the individual. Number one, we have to understand that you're hosting an international event. It means that one, you're going to cater different participants, you're going to cater different viewers, for example, from different countries, right? One, we think that this is benefits in terms of tourism, in terms of the economic activity. Because you're going to cater different participants. It means that a lot of people is going within your particular country. It means that as a hosting country, you have to book a lot of hotels, for example, you have to book a lot of travels, for example, and you have to pay your tickets in going to that particular country, right? So it means that this particular individual is going to going to send money in this particular country, and it means it is already a gain in terms of the tourism activity at that point, right? So we think that it's not really a gain, it's not really a loss at the end of the day, right? Because at some point there is going to be an individual. But in terms of that long-term benefits that we're going to tell you coming from opening opposition, we're going to tell you on how it's going to be better benefits these particular developing countries. Because we're talking about the international sporting events. It means that the viewers are not just from the international community, are not just from the international community whose main intention is sporting, but we think that we are also going to have viewers from the corporations, for example, right? Who is going to think on what type of investment they're going to take, right? So we think that it's going to be more strategic and it's going to be more beneficial if we're going to impose these particular sporting events, right? Because it means that you have now the capability to be recognized in the international community, you have the capability to be recognized by these particular corporations who who have those particular interests in order to gain profit, right? So we think that is more likely to happen is because we think that when corporation, especially multinational corporation, is going to see that you are capable of hosting these particular events, we think that they have more incentive now to put more incentives and to put more money in terms of this particular corporation in the developing countries, especially when they can be able to assure that giving them this particular investment, you can assure that they can be able to handle different particular individuals coming from the international community. Like for example, international corporation going to invest hotels, for example, because they know that they can be able to host these particular participants. So we think that that particular alone is already a gain in terms of the economic benefit. So if we're talking about developing countries having a lot of people having to solve a lot of problems, we think that is a problem on how you got the strategy, right? So we think that in terms of strategy, when you now have the economic activity, we think that you now better give this particular individual a better gain access in terms of the economic activity, in terms of the economic empowerment, right? So when you already have gained those particular investment, it means that you are more likely to give jobs for this particular individual because now you have a lot of investment coming from this particular corporation. So we think that in terms of the economic activity, we think that it's more likely to happen under our model, right? So for all that reasons, Mr. Chair, we're more likely to propose.
Mr. Chair, the thing that you need to look at in this debate is the characterization of what a developing country is. A developing country are usually countries that are very poor. And not just very poor, but these are countries that lack resources for their people, which means that they either lack education, there's not very accessible education for the masses, or there's not proper healthcare that can be given to the people, or there's a very big problem in their many facilities. But the opposition side showed us that the best way to actually fix these problems is to host these sporting events because it allows these tourists and these large companies to actually come into the country, right? But we say that that's not actually going to fix the problem at the end of the day because we're going to rely on the fact that the tourists will actually be able to pay more than what will be the cost of these to actually hold these events because it's not cheap to actually host events. It actually costs a lot for the infrastructures alone just to maintain these buildings after the competition is done. It will cost a lot to demolish the building once it's done, and the money that could have been used with those the money that could have been used in that situation. The money that could have been used during the time that the building was up could have been used for other stuff that could have been developing the countries in different ways and in ways that would have been more beneficial to the country. But before I go into my arguments,
If we're problem about improving education and health system, we think that is more likely to happen under a model because we have now the corporation is more likely to invest in your particular country.
corporations may be willing to invest, but it will not be a very, very long-term investment because they're more likely to actually leave the country once they actually see that the fame for the country is actually over after the actual sporting event or shortly after the sporting event because they've actually seen that the fame and the fame for the actual country is actually gone because nobody's actually watching over the country because there's no more SEA Games or there's no more Olympics. So it's actually going to happen where corporations won't actually want to stay there for a very, very long time. Now I have two arguments for this debate. I have two arguments. Why developing countries shouldn't actually host these sporting events and how this actually leads to better development for the country. First argument, why developing countries shouldn't actually host. whenever you need to host a certain competition similar to SEA Games or Olympics, you're going to focus a lot of your fundings on these infrastructures, a lot of these fundings on applications, because you want these tourists to actually come to you. And in the end of the day, and what happens with that is that you're focusing so much of your resources in a bit after that. You're still focusing so much on your resources on the infrastructures or on a way to actually have tourists look at you and say, oh, it's an actually nice country. But it's not a very reliable way to actually have these people come into your country and actually make sure that they'll actually spend enough to actually have paid more than what you've actually paid to actually host these events. And so you're in a situation where you haven't, wait now, not now. You're in a situation where you didn't actually, where there are sectors that should have been helped by the government, such as education or healthcare or public facilities, that hasn't actually been helped, and you're waiting for a very long time before you can actually give them the proper help they need. It's in a very unreliable way to actually give them the help, because you're waiting for you're actually hoping the tourists will actually give more than what you've actually built for, more than than the actual cost for you to actually have built these infrastructures and to actually host the events. But before that, wait.
Mr. Speaker, if your problem is that these countries are clearly incapable and clearly poor at the end of the day, shouldn't that be under the prerogative and jurisdiction of these countries to decide rather than clearly taking away their choice to begin with?
But the thing is that hosting an event like this is not actually a valid choice. The reason behind that is because, again, it costs a lot to actually host these events. And these events the money that could have been used to actually host these events could have been given directly to actually fund much more accessible education or much more accessible healthcare, or to actually give proper facilities and jobs to the people. And the money that could have been used to develop for these infrastructures could have been used to actually develop the people's needs, or actually build infrastructures, build houses for the people, or the spaces that could have been used for these buildings that take a lot to maintain and will take a very long time before they'll actually be demolished, could have been used for a lot more sustainable and long-term jobs that could have been built in that area. Now to my second argument. How do we better develop the country? Under our side, instead of actually spending the money on infrastructures or designing apps, one-time use apps, or using the money to maintain buildings or skate parks that that not a lot of people will actually use, then we could have been using these monies to develop the people. We could have given the money to actually, if we give the money to directly to better education, it will actually, in the long-term basis, it's a lot more reliable that we'll be able to produce people who's actually going to be competitive in the job market. It's a lot more reliable that we'll be able to develop the country, because these people will actually be able to give back to the country through remittance or just working in the country as a very efficient worker. Or we'll be able to use the funding directly to better the healthcare. We'll be able to use the money to better the healthcare, and so it's going to be a lot more easier. We'll be able to lessen the suffering of the people who can't actually access healthcare. Or we could use this money to actually develop the athletes that could have been joining these events. And so we could actually give them proper facilities to actually win an event, instead of focusing all our money and leaving all of our all of our players and all of our people, the most important people in a country, behind. We could have been using them to actually let them win these international games, which could actually increase the fame that they wanted to do. By increasing the fame, they'll be able to see that, oh, a country like Philippines actually has great facilities for boxing. Then I might want to move to the Philippines to actually train, or I might actually want to go there to actually see what it's like to train. And there's still going to be tourism, there's still going to be development, and there's still going to be tourism, there's still going to be development, and there's a lot more long-term and much more reliable ways to actually develop and help the country, compared to their unreliable side, where they have to hope that the money spent by tourists is going to be much more, or even just a bit more, compared to the very expensive cost of hosting a competition. And with that, I end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Opening up the Mr. Chair, the greatest advertisement that a developing country can do is to host an international event where you can maximize all the kind of audiences and you maximize all the kind of corporations that are able to invest in your country. The problem with this debate is that opening government tells you a very bad characterization of this debate. We tell you, Mr. Chair, coming from opening opposition, that this debate is that on whether or not the host country is corrupt and on whether or not the host country is capable. This debate is about the principal justification on why these countries should or should not be able to host this kind of events. Before I go on to my extension, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give you a couple of rebuttals coming from opening government. They told us, Mr. Chair, that we should not host international event as a developing country because of the reputation of this host country, because as a state, they're just a developing country and that the administration might be corrupt. Number one, Mr. Chair, we tell you that it only assumes under the principle that the administration is corrupt. But what if it's not? We tell you, Mr. Chair, that at the instance that the administration is not corrupt, we tell you that all the plights come from Prime Minister is broken down. But second, we tell you that this is not a debate. Principally, you should just prove to us why it's just or it's not just to host as an international nation. But second, second thing that they told us is that what if countries are poor, they're not able to host, or if even if they're able to host, we should use these resources strategically. You need to understand, Mr. Chair, that you need to understand what happens when you host a country or what happens before that. You need to understand, Mr. Chair, that in order to host an international event, there is actually a bidding process that occurs, Mr. Chair. Meaning that what happens in the bidding process is that these kinds of countries are able to bid in order to host a certain event, and there's a votation in order to kind of bid, and meaning that those kind of votations are voted for those kinds of countries. Meaning, Mr. Chair, that votation alone is just a manifestation that these countries acknowledge that these host countries are able and are capable in order to host these kinds of events. This has never been characterized to you by side government. We tell you, Mr. Chair, but even if at the instance that you can build infrastructures under side opening government, we tell you that this is value neutral at best. Because remember, Mr. Chair, that you can still build infrastructures on our side when you can get on the principle of economic benefits that my leader of opposition has been telling you. You can also get sustainable infrastructures, Mr. Chair, when you reuse or recycle these gyms, for example, and you use it for sports complex, for example, and such that. Meaning, Mr. Chair, that all the arguments coming from opening government is not true, and at best it's just value neutral. I'm going to talk to you about my extension in my speech, Mr. Chair. My extension will be how hosting international sporting events is the best platform in reaching critical audiences that eventually reaches the goal of economic development, and I'm going to discuss this under two levels of analysis. On number one, the kind of scope of audiences that you get, and then number two, the kind of alliances that you can build when you host an international event. Going on to the first level of analysis on the kind of scope of audiences, you need to understand, Mr. Chair, what is the nuance of an international sporting event. We do this, Mr. Chair, by asking the question of who are the participants of international events. Obviously, these are individuals from different countries who represent their own nation in a battle of greatness. This means that these events who garner these kinds of events in international sporting events are events which garners massive and incredible amount of support from their local nations supporting their own kind of candidate. Why is this then important, Mr. Chair? It's important because you need to understand how does international sporting events gain income in the first place. Number one, coming from my leader of opposition, he already told you that they gain income by having massive economic investments of corporations which flows within these countries. This has been already discussed to you by my leader of opposition, where international and local corporations like contractors, for example, and architects, for example, are tasked to build massive amounts of infrastructures in order to boost the economic development of that country. But beyond that, Mr. Chair, on second level, on how do they get income as an international sporting event, is number two, they also gain money by the massive influx of individuals going onto that country to support these kinds of candidates. How do they do that, Mr. Chair? They do that by tapping into tourist spots, for example, where massive influx of tourists are able to tap the local spots like Boracay, for example, or Bohol, and even Cagayan de Oro. I don't want to hear any arguments coming from government side telling you what if they poop in Boracay, for example. We tell you that this is not a debate. The debate is about the kind of influx of this individual and these tourists and these tourists can give to the kind of host countries. But second, it also flourishes restaurants and other local stores and businesses that are able to give leverage in order to flourish the tourism even more. Why is it then important, Mr. Chair? It's important because these are individuals who are foreigners. When they go back to their home country, Mr. Chair, they are now the living manifestations of advertisements. Like for example, they could say that, hey, Boracay and Siargao is a good place, you should visit it, as me as a foreigner telling to my foreigner friend. But second, that's why, Mr. Chair, on that level alone, we tell you that there is a massive incredible benefit when you host as a developing country an international sporting event. But on the second level of analysis, on how it boosts alliances of host countries to other nations, but before that, yes.
When the international community invests in this country expecting that those funds will go to the event, and this funding gets pocketed and diluted by corrupt politicians in that country, what's going to happen? There's more backlash to the country.
Sit down. That only assumes, Mr. Chair, that the administration or the current administration is corrupt. But we tell you, Mr. Chair, that if the current administration is corrupt, it is not the problem of the international hosting event in order to solve the current administration of being corrupt. So we tell you that there's no value in that POI. But on second level of analysis, Mr. Chair, on how does it boost the alliances of host countries to other nations, we tell you, Mr. Chair, that it boosts that when you host international events, it's also a collaboration of other countries and other international bodies to make the event successful. Meaning, Chair, for example, like Olympics, which also has an Olympic decision body backed up by other nations. This means that the host country will build alliances to forge a diplomatic relationship with other countries by doing collaboration and tell them that, hey, we're good partners in doing something, therefore we should collaborate even more in the future. Where do we see this, Mr. Chair? We see this, for example, when North Korea and South Korea were able to lessen the tension between them during the Long Korea War, for example, by collaborating with each other in the Sea Winter Games, for example. Why is it then important? It's important because not only you look at sporting events as a short term, but you also look at the long-term benefits, and it's also futuristic. And not just you do not just look at international sporting events as an international competition, but it's also a way in forging with other countries the benefits you can get in the futuristic years. If you want to get the benefit in the developing country, start with opening opposition, because opening opposition was the only house who have proven to you the exact same benefits that you can get in when you host an international sporting event. For all those reasons, we're very proud to host. Thanks.
Here. Thank you for the speech. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Not to interrupt a POI until the full 8 seconds have been passed. The previous POI is the last 4 seconds. Do not expect that to be to the options. Now, open those enough and use it here.
Mr. Chair, before I begin, I'd like to mention that basketball is my favorite sport. Simply put, it's cheap and it connects people. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chair, since due to the lack of analysis given by the opening government, I'm going to give you more analysis plus a new perspective that clarifies the impacts of government bench towards society in this motion. So, gentlemen in this room, we live in a society where there are sick dying in the street, where there are drug addicts using illegal substances in public daylight, where rape, burglary, and murder happens occasionally in developing nations, are coincidentally also the same nations which divert their governmental funds towards sports and international events marred with corruption. Something I will explain to you in 2 points. Firstly, how do nations destroy their moral obligation towards the people? And secondly, how does it provide injustice towards sports in general, Mr. Chair? So firstly, Mr. Chair, if developing nations were to host international sporting events disregarding all their local issues, they are simply voiding their moral obligation to citizens. 3 things to say about this, Mr. Chair. As the opening government already said, money should go to more important things like public infrastructure, welfare, etc. But to add on to this, Mr. Chair, secondly, why is this harmful? The poor use this as an escape from suffering, Mr. Chair. While good by principle, how is this harmful to society? Instead of the class system becoming static, instead of upwards mobility being present in society, Mr. Chair,
society remains stagnant. The poor people aspire to things towards sports instead of actual upwards mobility in society. Now, thirdly, Mr. Chair, a lack of political discussion is present in the opposition's model. How can I say this, Mr. Chair? Due to the fact that developing nations are pooling their resources towards international sporting events instead of focusing on their local issues, such as sick people dying in the streets, such as widespread drug use, Mr. Chair. Like in Rio, Mr. Chair, where poverty is a main aspect of their society, and yet they spend billions on the Olympics, and yet they disregard the people in their community. Now, my last addition to this first point, how is this harmful towards the local athletes, Mr. Chair? In this sense, in these international sporting events, Mr. Chair, you are giving foreigners higher priority than the locals. Instead of hosting local sporting events to promote the locals, you are instead allowing foreigners to take the spotlight, instead incentivizing foreigners to come to your country instead of just simply incentivizing your local athletes, Mr. Chair. Now, on to my second point. How does this provide sports injustice? So, this provides sports injustice. Now, this is our contribution, right? Our contribution, or basically our model, due to the fact that we noticed that the opening government really didn't have a model. So, this provides injustice toward the sport in general, Mr. Chair. How? Let me tell you how. Firstly, due to the knowing the fact that this is a developing nation, we can also know that we also know that since this is a developing nation, the commonplace theme is that they lack the infrastructure, they lack the resources, they lack the money in order to fund this event in the first place, Mr. Chair. So, why is this harmful, Mr. Chair? Two things to say about this. It ruins the public image of the sport itself, Mr. Chair. How? Because instead of the people, the international community, looking at this like an international sporting event which should be celebrated, it would rather look like a developing nation ignoring its local issues and instead focusing on kicking balls and shooting balls into a hoop. Instead of putting money towards the people, instead of funding the people, Mr. Chair, instead of putting the government taxes, which we pay in order to improve the betterment of society, Mr. Chair, it instead goes into international sporting events which would actually harm the country more than it would benefit it. So, how is this a rebuttal to the opening opposition's case, Mr. Chair? They keep on arguing that with these international sporting events, it would foster international relations. It would improve their image towards other nations. But why is this false, Mr. Chair? This is false simply due to the fact that instead of focusing on Michael Phelps beating a world record, instead of focusing on the fact that locals have helped each other in order to achieve the success of these international sporting event, Mr. Chair, you would rather see that this developing nation has instead focused towards the instead focused on sporting events instead of helping the people that are suffering in their community. Like in Rio, Mr. Chair, what happened in Rio? Billions of dollars were wasted, billions of dollars were lost, billions of dollars that could be put back into the community were instead put into the corrupt sporting facilities where billions of dollars were stolen. Now, what do I want the next speaker to say, Mr. Chair? I would want the next speaker to justify that even with all the corruption marring this event, even with all the amount of public backlash, the amount of fighting amongst the society, Mr. Chair, you would still be able to justify that developing nations should instead keep on going to hosting these international sporting events instead of simply letting other nations host other first world nations instead to host these sporting events. Now, in conclusion, Mr. Chair, if you are for keeping the integrity of sports as a whole, if you are for focusing on issues that really matter, you would side with the model and the only actual model in team closing government. Thank you.
countries or why poor countries or developing countries are poor to begin with doesn't always stem from internal factors, but are most likely on the ability of these countries to even create beneficial international relationships that are sure to exist and be created when you give them the ability to host international sporting events. But even if despite engaging with the government side, we think that these problems, which are usually deeply rooted societal limitations like structural poverty, for example, caused by corruption, or any other social injustices, are easier to solve if you have the whole world supporting you in every means possible, which is most likely existing through the sporting events that will be hosted in these countries, and we're going to prove that in our later arguments. But on further discussion, let's engage in about the whole case coming from both opposing and opening government. They told you that they actually share the same case. They told you that, hey, you know what, these countries are poor, which means that they're most likely not going to perform well, so we shouldn't give them the ability to host to begin with, and we should allocate these funds to urgent problems. We think that number one, if your problems are the harms, for example, that will happen if you let them host, we think that these countries are rational entities who are clearly capable of considering their limitations when accepting global offers. For example, this means that if your problem is that they're incapable to begin with, we think that you should still be able to give them the choice to decide, which they will obviously decline because of the first reason they're not capable to begin with, rather than clearly prohibiting them, because this is where we call out the whole government speech for not understanding or even characterizing to us what it means when you prohibit one country from hosting an event and what does it impact or what are the implications of that specific action. But before that, yes.
Did you hear what Chris said, Mr. Speaker? He told you that most of these developing countries have states and heads of state that are rational. This oftentimes doesn't even happen in the status quo nowadays. When the state and the heads of state don't even know what they're getting into when they have a project in the first place, nor how to complete the project to begin with.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's my second layer of analysis. But number two, even if these countries were actually irrational and stupid entities, for example, and would still accept these offers, we think that this is okay because now you get to foster accountability in two levels. Number one, accountability with the government, which means that you make these countries accountable for the decisions that they make, like being able to accept and create those kinds of better decisions for their country, for example, and being able to sit down when already done, being able to be accountable for the things that they get into, for example, and the things that they want to be in and in their international field. But secondly, accountability within the state, meaning that considering that corruption already exists in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, you can clearly see and manifest these kinds of things. We think that it's way better because now you get to be able to make people more engaging in being able to call out their government, for example. Talk about the 50 million culture that's clearly being called out by the whole society, ladies and gentlemen, because it's clearly overpriced. We think that these kinds of sporting events are the things that clearly makes people see what are the things that are sit down that the government is currently doing and clearly see that there's clearly something wrong with how the things are going. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that if your government or your country is corrupt, for example, it's way better that they get to host these kinds of sporting events because now the whole world looks at them and the whole people will have that kind of leverage to be able to call out their state, to call out these corrupt politicians, for example, for clearly not being able to give them the best kind of benefits or services at the end of the day. Because they told you that, hey, you should be able to allocate these funds to better problems. We think that that's more existing in a system where people get to be able to have that clamor to begin with. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, sit down, that the current system of how people interact and engage with the politicians, for example, is clearly desaturated and clearly not enough. Meaning that the clamor within the people, ladies and gentlemen, is clearly not ignited because of the fact that there's no manifestation or visibility of the already existing corruption that is clearly existing in the status quo. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that when you have these kinds of overpriced Goldron, for example, or clearly overpriced SEA Games competitions, you get to be able to have that kind of visibility within the people, which they could clearly call out and have a higher probability of even impeaching these kinds of people, ladies and gentlemen. So meaning that the higher probability of being able to stop corruption at its best, for example, is clearly existing in the hosting government. Sit down. But on a further discussion, let's have like a whole counterfactual, right? Because this is where the opening discussion lies. We think that the whole idea of prohibiting, this is where we go back to the explanation of how prohibition was clearly not characterized by the whole government speech, even with the closing. We think that this is where we call them out for not understanding what prohibition means. Tendency is, ladies and gentlemen, when you prohibit countries from being able to participate or even host these kinds of countries, you'll never be able to give them the chance, you'll never be able to give them the chance to be able to even interact with other countries. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that in these kinds of sporting events, you already have that clamor for them to be able to interact to begin with, to be able to even be seen by other people, because we think that when it comes to like a global perception or global interaction with these kinds of countries, these developing countries are mostly ignored or mostly neglected because of the fact that they're third world to begin with. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we this is where we generally dissect what it means to become a third world country. Tendency is, if we prohibit them from being able to host these kinds of sporting events, they'll never be able to have that shine or attention that the people will intrinsically put, for example, the moment that you're the person who hosts the thing. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that you intrinsically isolate them on a corner where clearly no one will be able to see them because you fear of the fact that they might do well or they might do bad on these kinds of hosting. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that you intrinsically negate all the benefits that you would most likely gain the moment that you actually make them have that choice. Because we think that if your problem are the harms, for example, then that's clearly okay. As long as you give them the choice to be able to decide whether or not they're going to accept the thing. But on a further discussion, what is an extension as the opposing government? We think that number one, this is where you get to be able to have better social economic relationships. And this is where we delineate from the opening discussion. Because we're going to give you a walkthrough. Number one, we're not going to rely on the whole assumption that tourism will solve everything, because we tell you that it's not. Ladies and gentlemen, the best way to be able to understand how these kinds of improvement will exist is through a macro level. Meaning that if you're a country, for example, who's hosting the whole sporting events, most tendency is you'd be able to have that kind of attention of world leaders. Meaning the tendency is through this kind of sporting events, you get to be able to interact and talk about trading, for example, or even like importing and exporting processes. Meaning that tendencies are you have a higher chances of being able to lower the tariffs that you have to pay when you import something on another country, for example. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want the whole society to be able to see how bad or how good of a government you are, you have to be able to have these sporting events, because these are the clear manifestations of your administration as the government. Very proud of folks.
Mr. Speaker, when a developing country hosts an international sport event, right, they are not necessarily going to get international solidarity. What they are doing in that case is providing a dehumanizing discount to the millions of their citizens that are starving on the street, to the social issues that have been left ignored, and to the people crying out for help to their governments. What do they get? They get coliseums. They get fake and bad publicity at the end of the day. And what they get is a historical state where that developing country did not live up to the integrity of the Olympic sport event, or so on and so forth. What they are going to get is a bad state on the history books, Madam Speaker, that's inherently harmful on their side. What did Enzo go in this debate and tell you about? Enzo actually extended, right, from opening government's discussion of things like welfare and things like, and you can allocate these funds better to the people and so on and so forth. Why? Because he actually provided the fresh principle discussion instead of the pragmatic discussion, the principle discussion on how sports are an escape for the millions of people who are in poverty in these nations, for example, to ignore the social issues in these nations and to instead focus on the sport event themselves. and to actually focus more on how this prevents accountability within the government. For example, when the citizens who are already mostly uneducated, right? For example, you're assuming that they're uneducated in developing countries, do not speak out against their government because they think that the government already did them a favor by providing them their favorite sport event in that country. But instead, what they actually did was a dehumanizing discount that actually serves as a front for corruption, and serves as a front for not actually addressing the social issues in society at the end of the day. What am I going to do in my speech, right? And first, I'm going to address, right, the closing opposition discussion and why necessarily this was harmful. We think that the Gulf bench necessarily had a lack of engagement with opening opposition, especially opening government. So I'm going to address the opposition bench's arguments, right? But before that, sit down. So what am I going to talk about on closing opposition? What did closing opposition necessarily tell you, right? They told you that to get international accountability for this developing nation, CO wants you to waste a bunch of billions of dollars. It wants you to waste a bunch of billions of dollars on infrastructure projects, right? Just to get international accountability. Why is this wrong, Mr. Speaker? It assumes, right, that in order to actually get accountability from your citizens, the gov has to fail. They want them to fail to get this accountability in the first place. Why do they want them to fail in the first place when it wastes billions of dollars that could have gone to their citizens if they did not do this in the first place? We think inherently that they should be accountable to their argument completely falling flat on that regard. But secondly, they tell you, right, coming from the closing opposition, coming from the closing opposition, right? They tell you that there's going to be more, for example, international, for example, people visiting the country, people, tourism in the country, so on and so forth. But we tell you that if there's more tourism and there's more international support in their country, there's more likelihood for a tourist in that country to go to the Rio Coliseum, right, for example, and see that there are dozens of children outside of the Coliseum who are starving. There's more international backlash on their side because if they have more international support and tourism, there's more likelihood for the international community to call out that country. That's what my POI actually addressed later, and they never engaged on their side. They basically told us, right, going on, let's address opening opposition, right? They basically told us that there's an assumption, we had an assumption on corruption on government bench, right? That they're going to assume on their side that they do indeed have these projects fulfilled at the end of the day. But why is this problematic, right? Even if these developing countries weren't corrupt in the first place, what are the inherent features of these developing countries? Firstly, they don't even have experience in these sports events to begin with, for example. What happens is, that even if we're going to assume and bite the bullet on our case, that these developing countries, which by the way are highly likely to be corrupt at the end of the day, right, Madam Mr. Speaker, even if they, for example, aren't corrupt, right, how do they guarantee on their side that these developing countries will actually allocate these funds and resources properly to what they want to achieve at the end of the day? There's no guarantee or even mechanization on their side as to how they accomplish this, right? They simply assume that benefit on their side. But secondly, they assume that the developing countries wouldn't even dilute these fundings in the first place to their corrupt politicians that oftentimes happens at the end of the day in current status quo, right? That's what happened in the Rio Olympics, where most people actually believed in Rio that they could host this event and actually pull it off. But at the end of the day, what happened is most of the corrupt politicians in that country accepted the international fame for a while, but when the event actually happened, they were called out for lacking services. They weren't matching the international support that should have gone into that event, and so on and so forth. They were called out for it. They were necessarily shamed for it on their side. What did opening opposition also tell you, right? Opening opposition. And why was Enzo's contribution necessarily helpful in addressing this, right? Enzo's contribution basically told you that sports is an escape for these individuals at the end of the day. Sports basically distracts these individuals. It serves as a front for government for them to say that, oh, we did what we could do for their citizens, but at the end of the day, they still lacked, right? Because what they provided were coliseums, not food, not shelter, not other basic services that these people needed at the end of the day, especially when we characterize these people or these nations as developing nations. Before I go on, yes.
Aside from the fact that they made me matter, I already told you that people trying to impeach or blow up these people don't have enough leverage, that's why they need visibility. But on further discussion, even if these corrupt countries don't hold these corrupt competitions, corruption would still exist. We don't have alternative at all.
If corruption did exist, right, we're still willing to accept the world in which corruption isn't engaged with in the first place to gain this accountability. We think that we have to assume assume on their side that corruption still happens if they want this accountability as a benefit on their side. But secondly, I wasn't even referring to new material, right? Because the material that I referenced was within the speech of my member earlier. So necessarily shame on closing opposition. What have I told you in my speech, right? I actually clarified how NS's contribution filled the gaps of opening government's contribution. We think that welfare and giving back to the people and funds for the people isn't enough at the end of the day to actually win us this debate, to win the debate at the end of the day. We think we actually clarified on our side of the house why firstly, sports is an escape for these people and dehumanizing discount the citizens of these developing nations. But secondly, we clarified that there would be more international backlash at the end of the day. They are not going to take international support and international funding on their side, because if they do indeed take that, they're also going to get the backlash that comes with when people realize that they're allocating these funds to improper uses of these funds at the end of the day. They need to be accountable to that. And the next speaker, very proud to propose.
Okay, so I'm actually my favorite sport. My favorite sport is debate. Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, how this debate has transpired so far has been a bunch of tautological statements coming from the opening government, reaching towards the closing government in the first half. Because I only have one issue to present with you today. This issue being, in which paradigm do we see these developing countries capitalize more on once they are the ones able to host these sporting events? But before that, a few layers of the direct rebuttal to the previous speaker, right? Now, the previous speaker has been very dismissive of my partner's case in the very first place. Stop painting to us a picture of a dismal society you can't even fix. Provide to us a plausible measure of alternatives that the bodily autonomy of a third world country is able to employ with their own means. Because hey, everyone agrees that third world countries are corrupt, right? Everyone already knows that. Starting from the concession of the opening government, we know that these authoritative people, these governments that are going to have to engage with interactions from international parties are still people that won't even have the own initiative to fix their own problems in their localities in the very first place, right? You guys have been throwing to us this whole with this adamant idea, with a propensity of a dreamy world where unnecessary measures of failures are not to be taken, right? Ladies and gentlemen, my partner has been very important to you in this debate by telling to us the pragmatic idea of what it means to actually fail and earn from that, right? Because we have to see the necessity of having to engage with corruption, which is very faulty on their side, because they told us that we shouldn't engage with corruption in the very first place. This is a self-adjusting mechanism that is uniquely contributed coming from the closing opposition, ladies and gentlemen. Now going on to my first issue, right? Later, in which paradigm do we see these developing countries capitalize more on, right? So the entire opening government's case has been rallying on and pivoting on the idea of economic involvement, the misuse of resources, and how this entirety of having these third world countries host these sporting events is going to paint a bad picture, right? This is fairly assumptive on your side to make this more believable by saying that we are going to paint a bad picture, that there is going to be a reliance on international parties, right? But you have to prove to us that we actually saw a third world country drastically fall into financial recession because they depended on an international country, right? Because you never solidified your claim by telling to us that these third world countries are going to continuously rely on these international parties, right? Moreover, counterfactual
actual looking at their model, once we see that a developing country can elevate themselves from a position without interaction, we don't necessarily see that that exists in status quo, right? Because there is no possible means of that, but that is not the primary goal here. What closing opposition wants to prove to you in this debate is that is the idea of how the level of interaction here is more beneficial of that, and how that puts these third world countries on a highlight, proving to various and significant benefits that substantiate on many issues that they are facing with. These issues that can only be tackled with self-adjusting mechanisms that are only possible on our side. Right? But before that, yes.
Mr. Chair, the closing opposition has been absent the past 4 years. Why? What happened in Brazil, a third world country? They funded the Olympics, which led to economical ruin, billions of dollars lost in funding. Please elaborate on this.
Lots of events are being continuously posted all the time. Are you going to specifically blame these international sporting events? Are you going to specifically blame these international sporting events for putting like the poor people at shame? When in status quo they are constantly dying already. These people are already suffering. In status quo, not even your government is trying to actually employing means to solve that, right? Which is not believable on their side. And it's such a frivolous assumption, right? Moreover, the member of government has been talking to you on the lack of political discussion. Sports is a politics in itself, and this is also a faulty idea by proving to you that there is no highlight on issues that are on localized issues, right? Because fine, let's use their example of what happened in Rio, right? Some of the athletes were actually being robbed in the streets there, right? We think that that is a significant highlight that these international sporting events can do, right? Because at the very end of the day, at least we are able to provide to you that these third world countries need self-correcting measures, right? And that can only be seen once we are able to let them have these international sporting events, right? And really, it's already tautological to prove to you that this ruins the image of soccer itself, because nobody is going to think that soccer is bad ever, not because it just puts shade on the poor people that they are dying, that, oh, that's not the issue, oh, that's not our priority, right? We don't think that, we think that it's like far-fetched already for them to assume that, and that isn't going to land very unworthy, because these sports are not an issue. Because these sports aren't the primary issue, right? When the primary issue is that corruption is already existing, corruption is already inherent to this, which is why we need to employ, which is why at least under our measures we best see the plausibility of corruption being highlighted and have these authoritative leaders on these third world countries held accountable, right? But yeah.
So for the Olympics, right, you just correct this random developing world, the developing nation, they're going to risk the integrity of their event just to correct this nation to provide accountability for them in the first place.
Yeah, it's okay. It's fairly okay to assume that the Olympics, the Olympics was a flop because we saw some issues that these third world countries weren't able to develop, right? Which is a better solution, which is a better long-term effect for our side, right? Because you guys have just been proving to us that, oh wait, at least in our measures, we're already looking at these poor people constantly dying, so the government itself should actually provide programs to feed them and provide them shelter. We don't necessarily see that existing ever in a third world country because all of them are inherently corrupt, and you can prove to us and weren't able to prove to us that at the very end of the day, right? So what did closing opposition tell to you in this debate? We have told you that our self-correcting measure is going to substantiate on the better means by providing to you a better countermeasure against corruption, which has been pivoted around this debate but has been very dismissive of the entire case provided to us by government, right? And having said that, I'm very proud to post here.
Add mo na siya. Yeah. Wala na po yung last year on your part. Yeah. That was so bad. That was so bad. Never understood anything.